Happy holidays, and thanks for joining today's webinar with Real Story Group. This wasn't planned, but Tony and I both have our festive colors on as we walk you through today's webinar on selecting the right customer data platform. Always an exciting topic for us, and appreciate you taking some time out of your day to join us for this presentation. Tony's going to take us through the majority of today's session, but my name is Scott Dill, and I just wanted to kick off with a couple of quick items of note. First, we will have time at the end for questions. So if you do have any questions or anecdotes you'd like to share, please feel free to enter those into the questions tab and to go to webinar control panel. Also, these slides will be available later this week. So please keep an eye out for that. And then for our subscribers on the line, this will be available in your subscriber library within the next few days. So keep an eye out for that. And also subscribers, just a reminder that all of the webinars that we've had over the last several months are available to you on demand in your subscriber library. So please don't hesitate to take a look at those. And if you ever have questions, just let us know. So to get started here today, I just wanted to provide you with a little bit of background about Real Story Group, as I do see a number of new names on the line today. So Real Story Group is an industry analyst firm, but we like to call ourselves a bit of a non-traditional analyst firm. We've been at this for 22 years, and for that entire time, we've adhered to the same model where we never work for the vendors that we cover in any way. We don't advise them on their strategy, and we don't write white papers for them or even take a cup of coffee from them. Our only focus is on you as a technology user and buyer, and telling you what these vendors do well, but also what they don't do so well and where they might fall short for you. So that's where the name Real Story Group comes from, because we're going to give you the real story and really pull no punches when it comes to describing which of these vendors ultimately will be the right fit for what it is that you're trying to do based on your specific use cases. Today, we're going to focus on customer data platforms. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tony to take us through the presentation. Tony?
Thanks, Scott. This is really one of my favorite topics and therefore fitting course to pursue here on our last webinar of the year, customer data platforms. Many of you have seen our MarTech stack vendor map, subway map, two map, whatever you want to call it, where these are all the different vendors that we evaluate at Real Story Group, and that we help organizations select these tools, and we kind of lay it out as a subway model, suggesting, of course, that different marketplaces are different lines on the subway. The orange line is what we're focused on here today, customer data platforms. Like every other line on this map, you've got this incredibly vibrant periphery, and then you have a kind of a center city with some of the big players like Adobe, Salesforce, Oracle, and others. And that tension sort of in the market certainly persists with respect to CDPs, and we'll have more to say about that. But the other thing about CDPs is very much designed to be integration software. So the relationship between CDPs and the other lines on this map, critically important. We'll have more to say about that as well. So first, I want to talk about the architectural dimension of this challenge, which is as important, if not more important, really, than in any other MarTech platform that you would license. Then we'll talk about the CDP marketplace itself, and then spend a good half of our time here talking about what's the right way to select a CDP before concluding with some key takeaways. So here's a traditional CDP model. You've probably seen models like this, where you've got source data, first-party data, zero-party data, second and third-party data in various forms, flowing into some customer data platform or other environment where there's a number of services that get applied to that data, like resolution, cleaning, enrichment, segmentation, so on and so forth. And then you push that data out to any number of different environments, both omni-channel engagement, paid media, potentially localized or even enterprise analytics. So this was the way that many people conceived of CDPs, and many vendors conceived of CDPs as soon as 5 years ago. Some CDP vendors still sort of pursue this model. But if we break this down more into more of a services component and operational component, the emerging large enterprise model looks like this, where you still have, of course, source data That data often needs very intense customer data processing. Typically, this is a data ops function where you're ingesting, transforming, cleaning, unifying, all those things that you can read under the blue column there. And then customer data activation, which is more of a marketing ops function, is about leveraging this customer data to within particular channels, whether they're owned and operated or paid. So you've got a customer API, segmentation services, event handling, activation services, maybe some other services around light field creation, personalization, orchestration, testing, and so forth. So that's logically, you can think of these as a process hub and an activation hub. Physically, these may be in the same CDP, or they may actually be distinct environments. And so that's really critical to understand from an architectural perspective, because as we'll see, the marketplace also kind of breaks down this way as well. And so if you make the wrong choice here, unfortunately, you have a very high likelihood of ending up not just in a poor fitting CDP, but a platform that literally you can't use because it's not doing what you need it to do, or it substantially overlaps with some existing capabilities. So this is a way of sort of turning that down into a different view where, you know, you have this customer data ecosystem in dark gray, and then within that you have the enterprise data fabric over to the left in light gray, and that's made up of core data services and then some sort of logical customer data hub. And so IT and data ops typically manage these, although they don't necessarily have to, but these are fairly heavy duty data processing and management services. Then you have customer data activation in orange, and then customer engagement in purple. Now, the reason why we break this out is because you'll see among CDP vendors really wide scope in terms of what they cover, and not surprisingly, they're responding to enterprises that may have really wide scope for what they're looking for from a CDP, right? So from a services perspective, it could be extremely wide and multifunctional, or much more narrower. And so we're not making any value judgments here. We're just suggesting that you need to be on the same page internally about what is the scope of CDP, what services are we really trying to render under the CDP, and what services would reasonably lie elsewhere in our data and MarTech stack. So another way of looking at this then is through the MarTech services references model. Now this is the B2C variant. You can check out our other webinars where we get into the B2P variant, but you probably recognize this sort of layer cake diagram where you have engagement channels at the top, and those of course continue to proliferate. You have interaction and delivery environments where your customers are meeting you in one capacity or another. And then a whole series of engagement services, so that's the first colored row down from the top, where many of us have been investing quite heavily over the past 2 decades. The problem with this model is that it helped us get really good at certain things like social media management, outbound marketing, web content management, and so forth. But it also created a lot of different silos and disjointed customer engagement experiences, and very difficult and expensive kind of lateral integration. So where we see the future going is what we call more sort of a legless model, where you have enterprise foundation services that live underneath these particular silos, and therefore can work cross silo. And in particular, I'll point you to the middle column here, the data column, where increasingly now we're seeing insights AI, but also you have, you know, customer data activation, customer data operations, enterprise data intelligence, and then to the right of that, decisioning. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because this is another scope issue, not just architectural, but functional, is that, you know, you may have a CDP vendor that says, look, all we do is customer data activation. That should be core to any CDP, and this is all we do, right? And so sometimes those vendors will call themselves composable. In other cases, they'll call themselves just a straight up marketing CDP. But then you may have CDP vendors that provide all kinds of other services, including, again, customer data operations, potentially enterprise data intelligence, a whole slew of potentially of decisioning services. Some CDPs even cover outbound marketing. Some of them are getting into insights AI and decisioning AI, although that still is relatively light. And so, you know, the question is, again, what is the scope of our CDP? So I won't have necessarily a preset answer here. In our own work with large enterprises, helping them select CDPs, we've seen quite a varied set of considerations here, sometimes unexpected considerations, both with respect to architectural scope and also functional scope, about what made sense to render under the CDP and what maybe were capabilities that you ought to leave more decoupled in your environment. So some key questions to answer here, and again, this is an area where we can help you with those questions, but if you don't answer those questions, you know, and you're looking at a marketplace of 30-something vendors, then you're really kind of behind the 8 ball. So let's look at the CDP marketplace, fascinating marketplace, really beginning to take more shape and form. And we really see it as a 2x2 matrix where you have this large bevy of independents in the top row, and then you have CDPs that are attached to MarTech suites in the bottom row. Generally speaking, the CDPs that attach to MarTech suites tend to be weaker and less independent players in your stack. There have been significant customer issues with them, and so we tend to suggest that you do very careful diligence before defaulting to one of those vendors. A lot of the action still is at the independent level, but even then, you can divide between, on the left, those that are really focused on more heavy-duty data ops-oriented data management and processing, and those that are focused more on data leverage, in other words, activation. Even within that, you can see within the CDP market, those that are more activation-oriented and those that are more decisioning-oriented. Now, even then, you can break it down further, where in the activation-oriented, underneath this dotted line here, we've got high touch and rudder stack, so-called composable CDPs, a lot of issues with them. They often get selected by data ops teams, marketing ops teams have had generally quite negative experiences with them. So you want to be very careful there. A lot more to say about that. And then on the decisioning side, the 4 at the bottom here, D&B, Syncari, LeadSpace, Terminus, these are B2B oriented CDPs. So this is a relatively newer space in the market. Unfortunately, those vendors tend to be somewhat weak and distracted with respect to CDPs, but they're out there and potentially worth considering. So now what you came for here, what's the right way to select a CDP? Well, the term of the day is really design thinking. This was the concept that underlay the book that my colleague Jared and I wrote, published through Rosenfeld Media, The Right Way to Select Technology. And so this is an agile-ish approach to replace what we've really seen as very ineffective waterfall-oriented approaches to selecting marketing technology in particular. So it's business-focused, it's team-based, it's empirical, it's iterative, and it's adaptive. So business focus means you want to focus on what you're trying to accomplish from a business perspective and use that as key discriminators among the vendors. Team-based, which means you need your marketing team, your marketing ops, your data team, IT and security, all the different stakeholders participating. Empirical, which means that it should be test-based, and there's a lot of interesting ways you can test CDPs. Iterative, which means that you don't have to get all your requirements right up front. You just have to get them in broad brush and then work your way through a series of test-based processes where you adapt and learn and follow the same kind of test and optimize cycles that you would do with marketing campaigns. Apply that to your selection process. So if you know about design thinking, you know it typically breaks down into empathy, definition, ideation, prototyping, and then testing. So the point to empathizing is really to create diverse user stories. At this point, we're looking at a marketplace of potentially 30 vendors, but your user stories, we'll see in a minute, really help you break down which vendors might be better fit. You can create an RFP and a vendor shortlist around that where you define much more specifically what you're looking for, and then go through an ideation process where you review proposals and demos. Again, these are not generic proposals and demos. These are against your particular use cases. Then we always recommend a 2-vendor bake-off. Talk about that in a minute, and then potentially while you're negotiating contracts, doing some sort of an optional technical or integration proof of concept. Now, we include that at the bottom because CDP contracts have historically been quite difficult to negotiate. We find a lot of obstinance on behalf of CDP vendors, sometimes taking 3 as long as 6 months by the time you select a vendor to ink a contract. And so forewarned is forearmed there. You can use that time to first prep yourself for a CDP implementation, but also to continue to test the platform, including things like certain types of capacity testing, UX testing, integration testing, so you're really clear what it is that you're getting. All right. Now, what are your CDP use cases? Historically, we've seen about as many as 10 potential use case categories. So we use these use case categories when we're evaluating CDP vendors in our research. And the important thing to understand is that no CDP vendor covers all 10 of these. In fact, a typical CDP vendor excels at maybe 2 or 3 of these and kind of covers 2 or 3 more. And the reality is that you probably shouldn't be trying to prioritize all of them, particularly within a single platform. So really thinking about, again, what is it that we're trying to really accomplish with the CDP becomes critical here. So in the first column, you see 2 that are very data oriented: advanced customer data management and omni-channel and offline data integration. Requires a lot of heavy lifting. In the middle column, you may or may not want this in a CDP. Many organizations do not, but you may want to be doing some predictive analytics and some real-time behavioral analysis, right? And so maybe this falls within the scope of CDP for you, maybe not. Then you get to the data leverage side, data activation side, with the 6 other use cases: outbound marketing, online personalization, e-commerce, which is a kind of a variant of that, household and channel marketing. We find a really critical differentiator because not all CDP vendors support that very well, paid media support, and then a somewhat newer capability that we're seeing organizations wanting to layer, at least on top of their CDP, is loyalty and rewards management. So these are just some prompts for you to think about the places where you're looking for a CDP to add value, but also this is what we use to generate custom shortlists, which vendors are more emphasize these different sorts of capabilities. So don't be mystical about this. You really should avoid traditional static quadrants and waves. They really speak to how good the analysts are in influencing, or the vendors are in influencing the analysts. They don't really tell you what happens in the real world. You can go and try out our real quadrant shortlist generator, which allows you to input the scenarios that are important to you, the strategic considerations that are important to you. You can try it for free. To get the full shebang, you do need to license our research, but it's going to give you a much more accurate shortlist and a custom set of research with the pros and cons about the vendors to really get you to narrow down to where you need to be. So here's an example of 2 different outputs. So here might be a more enterprisey CDP that's focused on more data processing and data management. So you've got omni-channel and offline aggregation, advanced customer data, maybe predictive analytics. And so we weighted those relatively evenly. This is what the real quadrant generates, and you can see there's a pretty broad scatter plot here among the 30-odd vendors that we cover. But you do see 5 or 6 that are in the upper right hand that are worth looking at. Now, what if we give you a completely different set of use cases, a more, say, marketing ops oriented CDP? You're going to get a very different set of vendors, somewhat larger set of vendors too, which is interesting. Again, a broad scatter plot, but probably more 12 or so vendors that support these 3 use cases on the left: outbound marketing, online personalization, and digital advertising support. So, so the vendors that make most sense for you are really going to vary with respect to what you're actually trying to do with a CDP. Now, I wanted to come back to this inverted triangle. There's a lot more to say here. You can look at previous webinars around selecting technology to give you more detail about these specific steps, but really wanted to impress on you the importance of a hands-on bake-off. We see too many large enterprises do something they'd never do, which is, if they were buying a car, of course you take it for a test drive. We see enterprises licensing CDPs without taking them for a test drive. And not just CDPs, other MarTech, but CDP being so foundational and a really important integration layer in your stack, it's essential that you try it first. We had a methodology around bake-offs before CDPs existed. We wondered, would this really work well for CDPs? And it turns out it does. We've done very successful bake-offs. They can go anywhere from 3 to 10 days. A lot of really interesting things you can test and discover about the platform, about yourself, about what the real costs are going to be. You use real scenarios. You use not necessarily real data, but dummy data. This, of course, can be generated. Your people in a real cloud environment. Try it out. Any vendor that pushes back here is a vendor you don't want to work with. Okay? So definitely try before you buy. And again, if you work with us, we can give you templates and guide you through this whole process. Wanted to remind you before we wrap up with some takeaways that if you have any questions or comments or anything you agree with or disagree with, feel free to use the questions tab in the your GoToWebinar control panel, and happy to come back and address those with you before we step away here. So let's wrap up with some key takeaways. So CDPs are increasingly foundational to an omni-channel stack. If you don't have your data house in order, you really can't do omni-channel, you can't do personalization. There's a lot of things you can't do unless you have your customer data house in order. But CDPs are not ends in themselves, they're a means to an end. And so you really need to understand exactly what are the business use cases. What's interesting is that the vendors, after kind of a period of childhood and adolescence, now as they go into adulthood, are really sorting themselves out into different categories, but particularly the extent to which they will or will not take on the sort of lower level data processing and management services. You do need to consider the proper scope of CDP in your particular stack. So we talked already about, with respect to your broader enterprise customer data ecosystem, but also with respect to adjacent services like personalization and marketing and so forth. You want to avoid having a unified customer record in a single departmental silo. So you don't want to be unifying customer records, for example, in your marketing automation platform. And I spoke to 2 clients today who are doing just that. It's causing a lot of issues because those platforms aren't really designed to do that. You definitely want to be doing unification at a lower level within your enterprise. Then once you sort out all of these issues with respect to CDP, you want to employ a more agile-ish selection process that definitely features adaptive testing. So, you're going to have lots of choices. Choice is good. The CDP marketplace is going to remain fragmented for some time. So you definitely want to use your architecture as a filter, but you want to prioritize your business scenarios as your prime criteria. And you'll still, the important thing about CDPs, although they're generally meant to be business platforms, you will still need developers and you will still need data ops people to make them run. So this has to really be kind of a joint venture among at least 3 different teams within your enterprise. Of course, we can help you make the right decisions here. There's 3 ways that you can work with Real Story Group. One is you can simply license our customer data platform research, and we'll help you find the best fit vendor. You can use our self-service tools like Real Quadrant. You can call us up and we can advise you on your strategy plans, shortlists, RFP, everything else. Larger enterprises often elect for a full stack subscription from us, so that's getting access to all of this research as well as best practices and advisory on how to optimize your stack as a whole. And the subset of those join our private MarTech Leadership Council, where they learn through exclusive peer sessions with their colleagues. They learn lessons, help each other out. We facilitate in-person and remote council meetings. Been really interesting. The last council meeting addressed organizational models, hot topic, particularly given macroeconomic turbulence. And then we spent about half the time just sharing what we were doing about AI and what was working and what wasn't. And that was super fascinating as well. So if you're interested in any of these things, feel free to contact my colleague Scott. And he's going to talk about next steps. And I'll remind you, if you have any questions or comments, we'll have time to address those. Just pop them into the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel.
Great, thanks, Tony. Yes, I'll just reinforce that you can always download excerpts from the research just to get a better sense of what we're saying about the vendors, how we evaluate them, and the type of depth that we get into, along with that pull no punches approach that we take, as we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. You can also reach out to us if you'd like to see real quadrants and try it out along with real time to really compare these vendors side by side and how they look against each other and what's going to be the right fit for what it is that you're trying to do. And we can always talk you through, which of the offerings that we have available would make the most sense for you and your colleagues. I do see one question that came in that looks like a very interesting one, Tony.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you to read it out loud because somehow it has disappeared from mine. So perhaps you can read it, Scott, for me, please.
Absolutely. So the question is, what if the decision is between buy versus build? Will your tool address that?
To some extent, I mean, if you put in a series of requirements and everyone ends up in the loser quadrant, then that's a conversation that we want to have. I think it's probably more a conversation to have up front, and then we can help you guide using some of the tools that we have. We have actually seen build in the CDP marketplace. Most commonly, it's in the B2B environment where some of the tools on offer don't always quite address what you might want from a CDP, and where you may have a somewhat smaller number, maybe 30 or 40,000 records, but an intense need to have a lot of attributes around those records and make it part of your marketing operations underneath a marketing automation platform. Those sorts of areas where we tend to see build. There is, of course, also the notion of composable CDPs. At this point, almost all CDPs are composable. It's just the extent to which there's composable. So there's, for better or worse, there's always a build element in there as well. Steve is asking an interesting question. In your experience, how are you seeing CDPs interrelate with other customer repositories, classic marketing databases, MDM? Do they seem to replace, or are they more additive? So it's a really good question. If we're talking about classic marketing databases, they tend to replace most of the key capabilities in that database. Now, unfortunately, many organizations, their marketing database and their system of record is often in their email platform or marketing automation platform, and that's not a good thing. So a CDP allows you to essentially liberate that data, manage it at a lower level, have many more attributes, and then still feed that data to an email marketing platform, but it's just not, that's more a system of reference than a system of record. So ideally, you will be replacing any kind of classic marketing database with your CDP. Now, you mentioned MDM, Master Data Management, and that's a little bit of a separate issue. So some of the more powerful processing-oriented CDPs essentially have MDM type services built in. But more commonly, I'm not suggesting this is a better model, but more commonly, we see MDM and creating a golden customer profile underneath a CDP separately, because there's a lot of reasons why you might want that in an enterprise. And then that feeds some core profile data, a limited set of attributes, but they're golden attributes to the CDP. And then you build on top of that with more kind of silver and bronze type data. So it's a great question, Steve, because it gets to this whole issue of where does a CDP sit in your architecture? And we know that there's some design patterns, but there's not a universal model here that fits all enterprises. Great. So with that, we reached the bottom of the half hour. Really appreciate you joining us today. Such an exciting topic for us. Encourage you to reach out to us if you have questions here that you need answer, or your organization needs an independent buddy to really help you sort all of this out. So with that, this is our last webinar of the year. So on behalf of Scott and the rest of the folks at Real Story Group, want to wish you a wonderful holiday, and we'll see you again in the new year. So long.